Paddington had just reached the top of his pyramid. At least, it had started off to be a pyramid, but it wasn't really. It wasn't any particular shape at all, and it was very rickety. Having placed the last tin on the top, Paddington was in trouble. He wanted to get down, but he couldn't. He reached out a paw and the mountain began to wobble. Paddington clung helplessly to the tins, swaying to and fro, watched by a fascinated audience. And then, without any warning, the whole lot collapsed again, only this time Paddington was on top and not underneath. A groan of disappointment went up from the crowd. "Best thing I've seen in years," said a man in the crowd to Mrs. Brown. "Blessed if I know how they think these things up." "Will he do it again, Mummy?" asked a small boy. "Don't think so, dear," said his mother. "I think he's finished for the day." She pointed to the window where the detective was removing a sorry-looking Paddington. Mrs. Brown hurried back to the entrance, followed by Judy. Inside the shop, the detective looked at Paddington and then at his notebook. "Blue duffel coat," he said. "Green woolen beret." He pulled the beret off. "Black ears." "I know who you are," he said grimly. "You're Paddington." Paddington nearly fell over backwards with astonishment. "However did you know that?" he said. "I'm a detective," said the man. "It's my job to know these things. We're always on the lookout for criminals." "But I'm not a criminal," said Paddington hotly. "I'm a bear. Besides, I was only tidying up the window." "Tidying up the window," the detective spluttered. "I don't know what Mr. Perkins will have to say. He only dressed it this morning." Paddington looked around uneasily. He could see Mrs. Brown and Judy hurrying towards him. In fact, there were several people coming his way, including an important-looking man in a black coat and striped trousers. They all reached him at the same time, and all began talking together. Paddington sat down on his case and watched them. There were times when it was much better to keep quiet, and this was one of them. In the end, it was the important-looking man who won because he had the loudest voice and kept talking when everyone else had finished. To Paddington's surprise, he reached down, took hold of his paw and started to shake it so hard he thought it was going to drop off. "Delighted to know you, Bear," he boomed. "Delighted to know you, and congratulations." "That's all right," said Paddington doubtfully. He didn't know why, but the man seemed very pleased. The man turned to Mrs. Brown. "You say his name is Paddington?" "That's right," said Mrs. Brown, "and I'm sure he didn't mean any harm." "Harm?" The man looked at Mrs. Brown in amazement. "Did you say harm? My dear lady, through the action of this bear, we've had the biggest crowd in years. Our telephone hasn't stopped ringing." He waved towards the entrance to the store, "and still they come." He placed his hand on Paddington's head. "Barkridge's," he said. "Barkridge's is grateful." He waved his other hand for silence. "We should like to show you our gratitude. If there's anything in the store you'd like." Paddington's eyes gleamed. He knew just what he wanted. He'd seen it on their way up to the outfitting department. It had been standing all by itself on a counter in the food store, the biggest one he'd ever seen, almost as big as him himself. "Please," he said, "I'd like one of those jars of marmalade, one of the big ones." If the manager of Barkridge's felt surprised, he didn't show it. He stood respectfully to one side by the entrance to the lift. "Marmalade it shall be," he said, pressing the button. "I think," said Paddington, "if you don't mind, I'd rather use the stairs." Chapter 5. Paddington and the Old Master. Paddington soon settled down and became one of the family. In fact, in no time at all, it was difficult to imagine what life had been like without him. He made himself useful about the house, and the days passed quickly. The Browns lived near the Portobello Road, where there was a big market, and quite often, when Mrs. Brown was busy, she let him go out to do the shopping for her. Mr. Brown made a shopping trolley for him, an old basket on wheels with a handle for steering it. Paddington was a good shopper and soon became well known to all the traders in the market. He was very thorough and took the job of shopping seriously. He would press the fruit to see if it had the right degree of firmness, as Mrs. Bird had shown him, and he was always on the lookout for bargains. He was a popular bear with the traders, and most of them went out of their way to save the best things of the day for him. "That bear gets more for his shilling than anyone I know," said Mrs. Bird. "I don't know how he gets away with it, really I don't. Must be the mean streak in him." "I'm not mean," said Paddington indignantly. "I'm just careful, that's all." "Whatever it is," replied Mrs. Bird, "you're worth your weight in gold." Paddington took this remark very seriously and spent a long time weighing himself in the bathroom scales. Eventually, he decided to consult his friend, Mr. Gruber, on the subject. Now, Paddington spent a lot of his time looking in shop windows, and of all the windows on Portobello Road, Mr. Gruber's was the best. For one thing, it was nice and low, so he could look in without having to stand on tiptoe, and for another, it was full of interesting things. Old pieces of furniture, medals, pots, pans, pictures. There were so many things. It was difficult to get inside the shop, and old Mr. Gruber spent a lot of his time sitting on a deck chair on the pavement. Mr. Gruber, in his turn, found Paddington very interesting, and soon they became great friends. Paddington often stopped there on his way home from the shopping expedition, and they spent many hours discussing South America, where Mr. Gruber had been to when he was a boy. Mr. Gruber usually had a bun and a cup of cocoa in the morning for what he called his elevenses, and had taken to sharing it with Paddington. There's nothing like a nice chat over a bun and a cup of cocoa, he used to say, and Paddington, who liked all three, agreed with him, even though the cocoa did make his whiskers go a funny colour. Paddington was always interested in bright things, and he consulted Mr. Gruber one morning on the subject of his Peruvian centavos. He had an idea in the back of his mind that they were worth a lot of money. He could perhaps sell them and buy a present for the Browns. The 1 and 6 a week pocket money Mr. Brown gave him was nice, but by the time he'd bought some buns on a Saturday morning, there wasn't much left. After a great deal of consideration, Mr. Gruber had advised Paddington to keep the coins. It's not always the brightest things that fetch the most money, Mr. Brown, he had said. Mr. Gruber always called Paddington Mr. Brown, and it made him feel very important. He'd taken Paddington to the back of the shop where his desk was, and from a drawer he'd taken a cardboard box of old coins. They'd been rather dirty and disappointing. "See these, Mr. Brown," he had said. "These are what they call sovereigns. You wouldn't think that they're very valuable to look at them, but they are. They're made of gold and they're worth 70 shillings each. That's more than £10 for an ounce. If you ever find any of those, just bring them to me." One day, having weighed himself carefully on the scales, Paddington hurried round to Mr. Gruber, taking with him a piece of paper from his scrapbook covered with mysterious calculations. After a big meal on a Sunday, Paddington had discovered he weighed nearly 16 pounds. He looked at his piece of paper again as he neared Mr. Gruber's shop. That was nearly 260 ounces, which meant he was nearly worth £2,500. Mr. Gruber listened carefully to all that Paddington had to tell him, then closed his eyes and thought for a moment. He was a kindly man, and he didn't want to disappoint Paddington. "I have no doubt," he said at last, "that you are worth that. You're obviously a very valuable young bear. I know it. Mr. and Mrs. Brown know it. Mrs. Bird knows it. But do other people?" He looked at Paddington over his glasses. "Things aren't always what they seem in this world, Mr. Brown," he said sadly. Paddington sighed. "It was very disappointing. I wish they were," he said. "It would be so nice." "Perhaps," said Mr. Gruber, mysteriously, "perhaps. But we wouldn't have any nice surprises then, would we?" He took Paddington into his shop and, after offering him a seat, disappeared for a moment. When he returned, he was carrying a large picture of a boat. At least half of it was a boat. The other half seemed to be a picture of a lady in a large hat. "There you are," he said proudly. "That's what I mean by things not always being what they seem. I like your opinion on it, Mr. Brown." Paddington felt rather flattered, but also puzzled. The picture didn't seem to be one thing or the other, and he said so. "Ah," said Mr. Gruber delightedly, It isn't at the moment, but just you wait until I've cleaned it. I gave 5 shillings for that picture years and years ago when it was just a picture of a sailing ship. And what do you think? When I started to clean it the other day, all the paint began to come off, and I discovered there was another painting underneath." He looked around, then lowered his voice. "Nobody else knows," he whispered, "but I think the one underneath may be valuable. It may be what they call an old master." Seeing that Paddington still looked puzzled, he explained to him that in the old days, when artists ran short of money and couldn't afford any canvas to paint on, they sometimes painted on top of old pictures, and sometimes, very occasionally, they painted them on top of pictures by artists who afterwards became very famous and whose pictures were worth a lot of money. But as they'd been painted over, no one knew anything about them. Sounds very complicated, said Paddington thoughtfully. Mr. Gruber thought for a long time about painting, which was one of his favourite subjects. But Paddington, though he was hugely interested in anything Mr. Gruber had to tell him, was hardly listening. Eventually, refusing Mr. Gruber's offer of a second cup of cocoa, he slipped off his chair and began making his way home. He raised his hat automatically whenever anyone said good day to him, but there was a faraway expression in his eyes. Even the smell of buns from the bakery passed by unheeded. Paddington had an idea. When he got home, he went upstairs to his room and lay on the bed for a long time, staring up at the ceiling. He was up there so long that Mrs. Bird became quite worried and poked her head round the door to know if he was all right. "Quite all right, thank you," said Paddington distantly. "I'm just thinking." Mrs. Bird closed the door and hurried downstairs to tell the others. Her news had a mixed reception. "I don't mind him just thinking," said Mrs. Brown with a worried expression on her face. "It's when he actually thinks of something that the trouble starts." But she was in the middle of her housework and soon forgot the matter. Certainly both she and Mrs. Bird were much too busy to notice a small figure of a bear creeping cautiously in the direction of Mr. Brown's shed a few minutes later. Nor did they see him return armed with a bottle of Mr. Brown's paint remover and a large pile of rags. Had they done so, they might have had good cause to worry. And if Mrs. Brown had seen him creeping on tiptoe into the drawing room, closing the door carefully behind him, she wouldn't have had a moment's peace. Fortunately, everyone was much too busy to notice any of these things. Even more fortunately, no one came into the drawing room for quite a long time, because Paddington was in a mess. Things hadn't gone at all according to plan. He was beginning to wish he'd listened more carefully to the things Mr. Gruber had said on the subject of cleaning paintings. To start with, even though he'd used almost half a bottle of Mr. Brown's paint remover, the picture had only come off in patches. Secondly, and what was even worse, where it had come off, there was nothing underneath, only the white canvas. Paddington stood back and surveyed his handiwork. Originally, it had been painting of a lake with blue sky and several sailing boats dotted round. Now, it looked like a storm at sea. All the boats had gone, and the sky was a funny shade of grey, and half the lake had disappeared. "What a good thing I found this old box of paints," he thought, as he stood back holding the end of the brush at paw's length and squinting as he once seen a real artist do. Holding a palette in his left paw, he squeezed more red paint onto it and then splodged it about with the brush. He looked nervously over his shoulder and then dabbed some of it onto the canvas. Paddington had found the paints in the cupboard under the stairs. A whole box of them. There were reds and greens, yellows and blues. In fact, there were so many different colours that it was difficult to know which one to choose first.